As we await for the arrival of the bodies of 14 SANDF soldiers who died in the DRC, let's look at the role of South Africa in what is meant to be somewhat of a peacekeeping mission. Professor Thomas Mandrup is the Associate Professor at Stellenbosch University as well as the Royal Danish Defence College. Professor, thank you so much for the time. You heard what the Minister had to say yesterday, so too the SANDF chief then as well. What was your takeaway from all of that? Because it felt as though there were a few bites in all of this where the hand was not speaking to the rest of the arm.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me, and good afternoon to the viewers as well. Yeah, I think it was in many aspects, it was a very interesting hearing in Parliament. And especially if you look into what the minister said and what she didn't say. One thing one can explain, there's an issue around operational security, basically talking about the security of the forces on the ground, which of course means they can't in public speak about those kind of issues. It can be all about the status of food and these kind of things on the ground. But I think for me, the big question here, and what have bothered me as a academic that has followed South African defense policy since the 90s, is the discrepancy between and lack of responsibility taken by the political level for what is going on the ground. In general, and I worked with soldiers and lectured to soldiers and teach to soldiers for the last 25, 30 years. Soldiers in general, they will they might question your order, but if the order is given, they will try to do their best on the ground to implement the mandate and with the tools they've been given. The problem with this mission is that they were given an offensive mandate, and that was reiterated several times also by the Chief of Defence yesterday. It was an offensive mission to disarm, to neutralize the M23 and other rebel groups later on. Has nothing to do with peacekeeping. And then you have a minister that goes in and say, we knew what we're going into. We knew, and we only needed things to defend ourselves. There was no need for the big firepower. So basically, it was a minister that acknowledged that they took a calculated risk going in. She assessed, or her predecessor assessed, that there was no need for air cover or for offensive tools in an offensive mission. And it raises so many questions on who was that made that assessment. Because one can ask the question, and Deputy Foreign Minister Boats said it last week. We are there because of Pan-African solidarity. We cannot afford not to be there. Yeah. So does this mean that it's ultimately incompetence on the part, particularly of the minister, or is it the SANDF chief, for example, and those who put forward the combat readiness and the mission readiness after that, then, that perhaps didn't actually put forward the right kind of status in order to get this done? That's difficult to say, because, you know, the role of the Chief of Defence in any defence force is to be the chief military advisor to basically to the president in the end. And it's in this respect, it's difficult to know what he said to the right people. It was quite interesting yesterday to hear that Hulumesa, the Deputy Defence Minister, said, I'm not involved in all this. So he kept very interesting a distance to this. This is something done between the chief, the Minister of Defence, and the President. I have nothing to do. I know nothing about this. So the question is, what has been said to the political level? I must say that before going into this mission, back in November 2023, a lot of warnings from academics, military analysts, military professionals was put forward to the political level. So I would be very, very surprised that if the politicians would say they didn't know. Unfortunately, what often happens here is that the political level do not take responsibility for what is going on. And sometimes, as you mentioned, then it's put on incompetence of certain military leaders, and they are blamed for what is going on, for what in reality is a political decision to deploy without the necessary means to implement the mandate. So basically, this is a political decision to deploy soldiers in that area without the needed means to fulfill the mandate. And they knew that before they went.
Professor, you've been following South Africa's defense, maybe not systems, but necessarily defensive play, shall we say then, for a number of years, as you made note of as well. Is South Africa's army efficient and capable enough to be undergoing, particularly this offensive that it is undergoing then in DRC?
The South African Defence Force, and I've stated this, my colleagues have stated that, I have PhD students who've worked on this for years. The South African Defence Force is underfunded, has been so, and has been depleted of renewal, operational renewal, equipment renewal for years. So what was after the end of the apartheid era and going into the new dispensation, and after the first defense package back from '98 and going forward, the needed renewal of equipment and capabilities has not taken place. And the Defense Force has had to make do with what was possible with a budget that was so small and too small, which means that they haven't got the equipment, and especially operational equipment, they need to actually undertake this kind of operations. You still got pockets of excellence in the Defence Force. Certain units, for instance, your Special Forces and others, that are well trained and have good international reputations. You have other segments of the Defence Force which is in trouble, both in terms of actually operational status, renewal of personnel, youngsters coming in, levels of training, and equipment that is needed. That again, but one has to acknowledge that the Defence Force, they are working with what they got and what the political level would actually allow them to have. And again, it was quite interesting when the Chief of Defence said yesterday, and he said that several times, that he is very much looking forward to Parliament implementing what they promised, the 1.58% of the GDP, going from the 0.58 now. And again, we have to remember, when the defense review was done in 2015, the Zuma government had said at the time that the Defence Force had to plan for 2%. So that whole project was done because Zuma and his government at that time told the Defence Force to plan for 2%, and then they reduced the budget even more. So there's always been a discrepancy here between these kind of things, and which means that they haven't got the tools needed to actually be an effective Defence Force as we would like them to be.
Yeah, look, I suppose we're not the only ones struggling to make 2% of GDP, because even NATO countries have had to had the brash warning of Donald Trump in order for any of them to really hit that 2% target as well for themselves. Does this become that wake-up call, do you think, for South Africa's military, for South Africa's Defence Force? Does this become the mea culpa moment in which we actually wake up and realize we need to do a whole lot more, especially if we're going to be trying to play peacekeeper or offensive mode then across the continent?
I think it's quite an interesting moment because you can argue, as the minister said yesterday, South Africa has been involved in numerous kind of peacekeeping operation or military operations, offensive, defensive, over the years, starting with Lesotho in '98 and going forward, going to Mozambique, Samim, and now, of course, some DRC. Whether it's a wake-up call, we have known this. We have known this for a long time. And every time the politicians, they, instead of giving more money, as they promised on several occasions, they take out a bit of more money from the Defence Force, or they put in additional tasks to the Defence Force. And what is the reality of the Defence Force? Remember, back in the mid-2000s, the police, the border patrol role was going back to the police. 2009, the government then decides, no. Police hasn't got the capacity to do so, so the Defence Force needs to still control the borders without additional budgets, which means that basically you have more than 3,000 to 5,000 troops being deployed domestically for that kind of operations. Then you have the problem with summers. Then you look around, the police cannot do it. Okay, we just after the Defence Force. Then you have the problem with your national security nodal points, your power plants and these kind of things, sabotage, whatever it is. Then you pull out the Defence Force once again. Anti-crime operations, you pull out the police, the Defence Force again. So you are putting, on top of reducing the budget, you're using the Defence Force for police, domestic police tasks, which of course is undermining the capacity of the Defence Force. It creates civil military problems in terms of democratic issues around the issue and the role of the Defence Force, and it reduces its capacity to go internationally. So there's a lot of challenges here which needs to be addressed. Is it a wake-up call? I doubt it. We saw in 2013 in Central African Republic, at airborne units being deployed, 200 soldiers. Again, why were they there on a bilateral agreement with Bosisi, the then president, and all that? Yeah. Airborne unit being there, you could not extract them. You didn't have the capacity to extract, and you lost 17.
Professor, so what's different about this? If we've been doing this before, what's the difference? I mean, it's not the first time. It's not our first deployment. What's different here? What's changed?
The change is that the politicians, they apparently it was so important for the politicians to deploy this time, but again, it was not important enough to actually give them the tools. So there was a political calculated risk that you could lose soldiers, and you were willing to do that and deploy them anyway. Yeah. And I think that is where the discussion should be, because who is responsible? Is it the chief of defense that is handling on orders? Is it because the mission was badly planned? He said himself, everyone knew this was offensive. This was an offensive mandate.
Exactly. And as you said a little bit earlier, it's this supposedly calculated risk that was then taken, which clearly didn't pan out. And now we've lost at least 14 soldiers at this point in time, and who knows how many more, which certainly could be at play. Professor, there's going to be a lot of questions to this, and Monday is going to be another interesting one, of course, as Parliament will debate this even further. Even the President's State of the Nation address is going to be very critical in answering what he knows and what he plans to do moving forward, amongst other things. Professor Thomas Mandrup, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it this afternoon. Stellenbosch University Associate Professor as well at the Royal Danish Defence College.